Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to have a chance to respond to Bill C-32, which pulls together a number of different items, some of which were in the governing party's fall economic statement, some of which date back to the budget that was introduced back in the spring. I'd like to start with where I usually do, which is some of the items that I appreciate that's in Bill C-32. The first was in the fall economic statement, and this is the governing party's stated intent to finally fully eliminate interest on Canada student loans. This was set to expire March 31st of this coming year, as they were temporarily waiving interest. And if Bill C-32 were to pass, this would become a permanent measure. This is critical because the numbers I have for the average student debt for a student in this country is over $26,000 a year. And this is a time when young people are already dealt a pretty bad hand, whether it's the rising cost of housing while their wages don't keep up, whether it's the gig economy that they're getting thrown into, or the climate crisis that they're going to deal with, the repercussions of decisions that are or are not made in this place and others around the world. And so this is a measure that would save, it's not a huge, but it's a significant amount. It's $410 on average per student per year. And that's a step in the right direction, something that I'm happy to support and to call out the importance of while encouraging the governing party to go further. Secondly, there is inclusion here of a measure from Budget 2022, which is the Canada Recovery Dividend. It was announced last April. It's finally being implemented here. It will require banks and life insurance companies to pay a one-time 15% tax on profits above $1 billion over the next 5 years. The Parliamentary Budget Officer did a review of this and found that this will raise $3 billion in revenue on its own, more than enough to pay for eliminating interest on students' loans. So it's clear here that it's possible for the governing party to raise revenue and use that to address really critical needs. The third point I'll mention in terms of what I was encouraged is something that wasn't in the fall economic statement, and that was talk of a potential further increase for another tax credit for carbon capture and storage. It's a false climate solution, and it is going in the wrong direction. Back in the budget, the governing party introduced this as a new fossil fuel subsidy to the tune of $8.6 billion a year. Carbon capture has been studied around the world. 32 of 42 times it's been implemented, emissions have actually gone up. And so I was at least glad that despite all the lobbying from oil and gas companies across the country, at least in this Bill C-32 and in the fall economic statement, there wasn't a further increase to send billions more in a new fossil fuel subsidy. I'd like to turn now to some areas where I'd encourage the governing party to consider going further, if not in C-32, then in Budget 2023. I'll start with climate because we've heard it very clearly. Here's a line from the co-chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Working Group 3 from back in April. His name is Jim Skia. Mr. Skia says, it's now or never if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C. Without immediate and deep emissions reductions, it will be impossible. Now, this is at a time when profits from the oil and gas industry are just off the rails. Imperial Oil, for example, they reported profits of $6.2 billion in the first 9 months of this year, compared to the same period last year, and it was $1.7 billion. It's more than almost a 4 times increase in profits. Now, how are they doing this? Well, they're gouging Canadians at the pumps. Wholesale margins, in other words, profits per litre, are up 18 cents a litre. And so, no doubt, one solution is the same Canada Recovery Dividend that I mentioned earlier that's being applied to banks and life insurance. Why not apply that to oil and gas? In fact, thanks to colleagues of ours here, the MP for Elmwood Transcona and Churchill-Kiwadanook Aski, we know how much this would have raised. it would have raised $4.4 billion a year that could be used to invest in proven climate solutions, on top of the tens of billions we could be eliminating in other subsidies currently continuing to go to the very sector most responsible for the crisis. Of course, we can't expect the arsonist to put out the fire. I'll also point out that eliminating these subsidies is part of the confidence and supply agreement signed between the governing party and the NDP, one line of which mentions a commitment to develop a plan to phase out public financing of the fossil fuel sector, including from Crown corporations, with early moves in 2022. I would have loved to have seen one of those early moves in C32, and we've got about 2 weeks left to see one of those early moves. And if they were to make those moves, they could invest in renovations across the country as called for by the Green Budget Coalition, calling for a $10 billion investment in deep energy retrofits so that homeowners can invest in reducing their emissions. And as they do so, for every dollar they spend, contributing $2 to $5 of tax revenue that could be reinvested in climate solutions, or investing in ground transportation, for example, which also we don't see in Bill C-32. The second gap that I think is really important for the governing party to pay attention to is following through on their promise to address mental health. Mental health is health. And whether we listen to students across the country, housing providers, healthcare professionals, of course, we need to be investing in mental health, and yet we haven't seen that in either the budget from last year, this fall economic statement. It was a $4.5 billion commitment that was made in the Liberal Party's platform, and I think it's incumbent on all of us here as parliamentarians to continue to put pressure to have that commitment realized, recognizing that there wasn't a cent of it committed in last year's budget, nor do we see anything in the fall economic statement. The third piece I think is really important for us to be calling out, that I'd encourage the governing party to go further, is to follow through on addressing the disproportionate rates of poverty being experienced by those with disabilities across the country. It's over 40% of those living with a disability who are living in poverty today. And while we are slowly making progress on Bill C-22 that would bring about a guaranteed income for folks with disabilities, and I'm looking forward to seeing amendments passed at committee to improve C-22. In the meantime, nothing changes for a person with a disability living in poverty. And we know that it's possible for parliamentarians to provide emergency supports because they did it in the midst of the pandemic. And so I joined disability advocates from across the country calling for a disability emergency response benefit to address the gap, to provide support today until we get towards a more permanent solution, and ideally a holistic one when C-22 ideally gets passed with improvements. Last, recognizing my time is coming to a close, I'll just briefly share on housing. We've heard already this afternoon some speakers mention while money is being spent, the results aren't there. In my community, homelessness has tripled in the last 3 years, from just over 300 people living unsheltered to over 1,000. It's obvious more needs to be done. There are some initial measures in C-32, including a tax on those who are flipping homes in less than a year. But if we were to recognize and really be honest about homes needing to be places for people to live and not commodities for investors to trade, there is far more that can and should be done to tilt the market back towards homes for people to live in. To close then, again, I think it's important to be clear. There are some important and timely measures in C-32, and I would strongly encourage the governing party to go further on some of the areas mentioned here. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Fleetwood Port Kells.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm wondering if the honourable member has anything developed. Give us an estimate of the fall in demand for gas and diesel once we hit 2035 and thereafter, when all new passenger vehicles and light-duty trucks are required to be electric, both here and in the United States, or at least in many states in the U.S., because we keep hearing that there's going to be demand for fossil fuels for a long time to come. Maybe so, but maybe not at the levels that we've experienced so far.
The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Yes, thank you to the member for the question. It's an important one because it calls out that supply and demand are forces that are experienced within policy decisions that are made here. And decisions that would incentivize electric vehicles, as well as decisions that would invest in meaningful ground transportation across the country. For example, rail. Investments in rail are what will help us reduce demand for diesel and other fuels, recognizing that the science doesn't compromise. For Canada to do its fair share, we need to leave 83% of proven fossil fuel reserves under the ground. We cannot combust those fossil fuels if we want to do our part to hold on to the possibility of no more than a 1.5 degree rise in global average temperatures. And so I'm happy to work with him and other members to put in place policies that would support Canadians to reduce demand on oil. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Regina Louvain.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it's a pleasure to take to my feet and ask a question of the member from Kitchener. At the beginning of his speech, he talked about carbon capture and sequestration. And it's something that's very close to my heart in Saskatchewan. We had one of the largest scale working facilities in the world, and it has taken the equivalent of millions of cars off of the road over the years it has been functioning. And it was a large investment by the government of Saskatchewan, and it has done a lot to clean up our environment in Saskatchewan. Actually, the Petroleum Technology Research Centre said Saskatchewan has the highest reduction in emissions in the country. And a lot of that is because of the carbon capture and sequestration technology we had. So in his earlier comments, he said that that was not true. So I'm wondering, in the spirit of not sharing misinformation, that he could come to the realization, as my NDP colleagues should as well, is that carbon capture and sequestration is a good way to keep our environment clean and still produce the much needed food, fertilizer, and fuel that we need to feed the world.
Absolutely.
The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you for the question from the member for Regina Louvain. I'm happy to restate what I said earlier, which is that globally, 32 out of 40 times that carbon capture has been implemented, emissions have gone up. The fact is, this is an extremely inefficient technology. It's a huge risk, and that governments should be investing in proven climate solutions. They're right in front of us, helping Canadians retrofit their homes, insulate their attics. These are the most efficient ways to reduce emissions. And if those in the oil and gas industry think carbon capture is such a lovely idea, I'd encourage them to invest their own funds, but don't use taxpayer money for it.
Question et commentaire.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member for Kitchener Centre and I agree on the fact that the bill is not satisfactory. But it doesn't do much, so it's not necessary. We could have just waited for the full budget. We have a minority government. We might have an election after that budget. Maybe the Green Party will form government. Who knows? We know that Canada's economy runs on oil. So for the next election, what would he propose to make Canada's economy carbon neutral, concretely, tangibly, because there's not much tangible from the Liberals?
Member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you for the question from the honourable member. I would encourage the governing party, and I have no illusions that Greens are going to form government in the next election, but I think what's important is that for all members to show up here and focus on what experts are telling us is required. And I would point the governing party towards the Green Budget Coalition's recent report that walks through line by line, whether it's investing in home energy retrofits, ground transportation, whether it's electrifying the grid. And in fact, Quebec, that currently sells its electricity, its hydro clean electricity, out to the U.S. at 5 cents a kilowatt hour, of course Ontario should be purchasing that. These are the kinds of investments that are being recommended by the Green Budget Coalition that we'd be supporting in full force. Thank you.